Hello, good afternoon. Another episode in this series roughly based on the idea of empathy. You should by now be able to see a common frame running through most of these documentaries, and I shall be continuing that in today's and then in the next one. But firstly, an announcement, if I may. I'm going to be opening a new channel this week, specifically for those who are learning English, where I'll try and explain some of the most difficult points of English that my students encounter, certainly. The first episode will be how to talk about the future in English. So we'll be looking at will, going to, and the present continuous. I'll post details about that as soon as it's up and running. Okay. Now, the philosopher Bertrand Russell had a very, very long life. He was born in 1872 into an aristocratic family, and finally died in 1970. And his intellectual work, which lasted all of his adult life, is often divided into two sections. The first, perhaps, runs from the late 19th century up to around about 1913, when Russell was doing groundbreaking, very original, and very, very influential work in logic. And then, from 1914 onwards, he became that rare beast in Britain, a sort of public intellectual, I beg your pardon. According to his biographer Ray Monk, this second and much longer period of his life was marked by empty rhetoric and blind dogmatism. Now, I think that's a little bit unfair. He was a man who was very sure of his opinions, certainly, and he could perhaps occasionally be dogmatic, but he also spoke, in my view, a lot of common sense. In 1950, he was awarded the Nobel Prize, and in his acceptance speech in December of that year, he spoke about the desires that motivate humans, and I think what he has to say quite neatly fits in with the general theme of these talks. He stated that all human activity is prompted by desire, some of which are not politically important, such as, for example, the desire to marry. That rarely causes political problems. But he divided desires into two groups. A primary group, which covered the necessities of life, such as food, shelter, and clothing. And he said that when these things are scarce, the very basic needs, when they are scarce, there are really no limits to what man will do in order to obtain them. But once these basic necessities are covered more or less securely, which is certainly not true all over the planet even now, but here in the rich West, we normally can guarantee most people food, shelter and clothing. So when these are guaranteed, then other desires kick in. And the first he mentions is acquisitiveness. We always want more. Even though our basic needs are met, we want more things. And this, says Russell, is basically the mainspring of the capitalist economy. But it's not in itself the most powerful desire, which might surprise us. We always, if we have a car, we then want a better car. If we have a small library of 50 books, we want 60 books, etc. We want more things. But more powerful than this, Russell believed, was rivalry. And he says that the world would be a happier place if acquisitiveness were always stronger than rivalry. But, in fact, a great many men will cheerfully face impoverishment if they can thereby secure complete ruin for their rivals. And we do see this rivalry in all phases of social life. Sometimes it's channeled into relatively innocuous activities such as sport. Sport could hardly exist without rivalry. But when it takes place on a day-to-day basis, I always must be better, must do more, must be more intelligent, more commanding, more interesting than the person next to me. Then it can be, and often is, quite a negative thing. The next point he makes is vanity, and he claims that this is a very potent desire. Children, he says, are always doing things to draw attention to themselves, and really adults are much the same, and vanity grows. The more you are talked about, the more you want to be talked about. And we can see that in all sorts of aspects. Sometimes it's reasonably harmless. For example, I'm constantly checking how many thousands of people are viewing these YouTube videos. Well, this is vanity, but I like to think it's relatively harmless in that case. But the problem with this, the problem with acquisitiveness, rivalry, and vanity, and the next one I'll mention as well, is that they all are self-centered. And the self, of course, is the innermost circle of the Dunbar numbers that we looked at in a previous video. The next one that he mentions is love of power, that he says is related to vanity, but is not exactly the same. Vanity, he claims, needs glory. Perhaps we would rather say nowadays fame, but like a film star, you can have fame with absolutely no power. Although often we do ask people who are completely innocent in any experience of fields, we do ask them their opinion of things simply because they are famous. And quite frequently, a famous person is vain enough to believe that his or her opinion is of interest to the rest of us. But love of power like vanity itself, is insatiable. Although Russell says that love of power need not be negative. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's something of Hitler in all of us, because the pursuit of knowledge itself is a love of power. You want more knowledge, to know more about things, to understand more, and therefore appear at least to have some power over the world in which we live. A reformer in politics can love power as much as a despot does. Other desires he mentions are a love of excitement, and this can be very destructive, of course. He points out that in primal societies, where people were hunting and cooking and what have you, usually people were too exhausted to do more than what they had to survive. But now, with our immediate needs met, and if we're lucky enough to have a job, enough money to buy us those extra things, we all need something more. And now comes another drive, which will form the basis of next week's video as well, when I move on to talk about prejudice. But this drive is that of fear and hate. And to quote Russell, he says, "I think it may be taken as the rule among primitive men that they both fear and hate whatever is unfamiliar. They have their own herd, originally a very small one, and within one herd all are friends, unless there is some special ground of enmity. Other herds are potential or actual enemies. It is this primitive mechanism which still controls our instinctive reaction to foreign nations." And then he observes that we love those who hate our enemies, and if we had no enemies, there'd be few people to identify with and love. He says that this primitive mechanism still controls our instinctive reaction to foreign nations. That I think is true, but it doesn't stop there, and this is something that I will go on to talk about next time. This is true, says Russell again to quote, so long as we are concerned solely with attitudes towards other human beings. You might regard the soil as your enemy because it yields reluctantly and niggardly subsistence. You might regard Mother Nature in general as your enemy and envisage human life as a struggle to get the better of human nature. What he's suggesting here is that instead of concentrating on disliking a different group, i.e. not one of our herd, and disliking them because of their foreignness, their colour, their gender, whatever it may be, we might be better served by focusing on an enemy that we could all concentrate on, and it might stick in the craw of some people for him to consider Mother Nature as an enemy. But in fact, he's probably right here. We need to control nature. We can't be controlled by it. And the idea of making nature more productive and conserving it, but to serve the needs of the human race, is becoming of paramount importance. To continue the quote, if men viewed life in this way, cooperation of the whole human race would become easy. Well, easy might be overdoing it a bit, but possible, perhaps. Men could easily be brought to view life in this way if schools, newspapers and politicians devoted themselves to this end. But schools are out to teach patriotism, newspapers are out to stir up excitement, and politicians are out to get re-elected. None of the three, therefore, can do anything towards saving the human race from reciprocal suicide. Well, since the 1950s, schools have probably shifted their focus a little bit, but newspapers, websites, are still out to stir up excitement, and politicians, in democracies at least, are still out to get re-elected. There are problems with this attitude, and these are problems that I will come to next week. Okay, thank you.